Derek had been staring into the dark stream when he heard Sophie scream Jason's name. By the time he turned around, he only caught a glimpse of what was happening, and he still barely believed it. Jason's shoes were the last part of him to disappear into the wall before vanishing completely. Derek replayed that moment over and over again. There was something so fundamentally disturbing about the helplessness of their situation. Losing friends, one by one, being hungry, tired, and cold. All of them seemed to be just waiting their turn to die. Yet the thought came to him that he didn't believe that Jason was dead. Something strange happened, and he believed him to be in some sort of danger, but he didn't believe that he was gone. At least, he didn't want to. Then he thought back to Megan's words about Ryan's fate. She had said that Ryan isn't dead. She inferred that he suffered a fate far worse for a long time after Jason disappeared. All of them tried to discover how to pass through the wall. It was all in vain. They couldn't figure it out. The wall, though crude and rough, was solid, with no discernible secret openings they could detect. Though they all knew what they saw. It was no doorway that Jason disappeared through. At least, not a normal one. He went through the rock. That was the truth. Eventually they gave up, and each one had a different opinion of what to do next. Amber wanted to go back into the house and try to make a dash to the door. She was desperate to get outside. Derek doubted that she had much energy for running left in her. Sophie wanted to wait and see if Jason reappeared. She hated the idea of leaving him behind. Megan had gone strangely mute. Or rather, she returned to how she was before this nightmare began. She offered no opinions or suggestions. Her eyes remained haunted, and she jumped at every sound that was not the river. Kyle thought they should continue following the river. He still held on to the belief that it would lead to above ground. Derek weighed every option. The house seemed out of the question. They had failed there already. It would bear no different fruit to try again. He was sure of this. Waiting for Jason to reappear seemed almost equally foolish. If Jason never came, then they would starve there for nothing. What if he did return? In what state would he be in? What if he returned dead? Action was needed, and there only seemed one course to take. Follow the river. When Derek made his mind known, Kyle was more than ready to leave. Amber didn't have the energy to make protest. Only Sophie remained conflicted. She eyed the symbol on the wall, as if to force it to summon Jason back to them. Nothing happened. Her shoulders slumped. "I guess we don't have a choice," she said, looking at Derek. "I hope this isn't the wrong decision." "I hope so too," Derek said. They moved down the dim tunnel, the roar of the river ever at their side. It was spacious, empty, and the floor was smooth, so their travel was relatively easy. Yet the way was long, and soon they lost track of how long they traversed. In the darkness, Amber stumbled on a stone. She didn't even cry out as she hit the floor hard. Derek looked back, expecting her to get back up. She didn't move. He rushed to her side. Kyle joined him, and they both hoisted her up by her arms. Her head lolled. Derek sucked in a breath when he saw a trickle of blood coming down from her hairline. "She hit her head," Sophie said. "We need to set her down, let her rest for a while." Kyle and Derek propped her up against the cave wall, and then all of them sat. None spoke. Derek looked down the tunnel, hoping to see something down the way. It seemed to stretch on forever. "I don't think any of us are going to make it at this rate," Kyle said, his voice seeming on the verge of tears. "I don't want to die like this," Derek bit his lip. "Amber made the right call when she scouted ahead that time we were in trouble," he said. "I can go ahead and check out what's down the ways. I'll come back when I find something." "I'll come with you," Kyle said. Derek shook his head. No, someone is going to have to help Sophie with Amber, Derek said. You shouldn't go alone, though, Sophie said. Derek nodded, knowing she was right. Megan, you can come with me, he said. Megan looked at him. He half expected her to just ignore him, but then she spoke. Sure, she said, and stood up. She brushed off the dirt from her pants. It didn't really do much. Derek got up too. You guys rest for as long as you need, he said to Sophie and Kyle. Hopefully we'll be back with good news. Okay, Sophie said. Good luck. Yeah, Kyle said. Try not to get eaten or lost. Derek gave him a wry grin. I guess it's too late not to do the latter, he said. Megan waved goodbye, and together they left their friends behind. Without their added presence, Derek felt as if the oppressive, dark atmosphere closed in on him in a smothering embrace. He clenched his fists, wanting it all to be over. That's when he felt a hand on his. For a terrible moment, he thought the monster had finally gotten him. He would be trussed into waiting jaws, and then it would eat him. Yet, when he looked over, he met Megan's eyes. Her gaze had a saddened quality, and the smile on her lips also seemed forlorn. He could not read her thoughts. I'm sorry, he said at last. It's okay, she said, slipping her hand into his, their fingers meshed together. No, he said. I shouldn't have said those things to you. You don't have to apologize, Megan said. A lot of what you said is true. I didn't have to say it that way, though, he said. She looked at him for a long moment, the same mournful smile on her face. I appreciate that, she said. The tunnel continued, much as it had, and Derek began to lose hope that they were going to find anything that would give them hope of escape. Just as his mood was at its lowest, something finally changed. Megan saw it first, though he wasn't sure how, since he was looking in the same direction and couldn't see it until she pointed it out. She yanked him back and pointed a finger straight ahead. Derek, look, she said. Derek gasped, and he felt his blood turn ice cold. The cave had come to a dead end. No, 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 Derek said. He tried to rush to get a closer look, but Megan was firm and yanked him back again. Don't go near it, she said. When he looked at her, her eyes were wide with terror. Her lower lip quivered. Her hand squeezed so hard it almost pained him. What is it? He said in a whisper. That's, she said, but never finished, because what they heard next caused them both to freeze. A sound wafted out to them, like a swaying breeze. It came, and then it went. It came and went. Is that? Derek began to say, but Megan clapped a hand over his mouth. She mouthed for him to be quiet. He looked at her confused for a second. Then his eyes widened as his mind realized with horror what they were hearing. It was breathing. Derek spoke very softly when Megan finally took back her hand. What is that? He said. I don't know, Megan said. It isn't the thing that's hunting us. At least, I am pretty sure. Are you telling me there is more than one monster down here? Derek said. We already saw that there is, Megan said. It took Jason. Derek shook his head. That wasn't the hunter, he said. No, that was something else, she said. What? Derek said. Megan thought for a long time, then said, I don't know. They stayed silent for a long time, listening to the sound of the breathing. Derek tried to imagine the size of whatever it could be. The breathing was smooth and not threatening necessarily, but it had a powerful presence. It was like being next to a powerful engine that was only idling. If awakened, it could roar with terrifying strength. Derek imagined that if it was as big as his terrified mind imagined, then it would follow that its appetite was of a similar size. "We need to go back," he said. "We can't keep going this way." Megan got an odd look over her eye. "No," she said after a while. "We have to take a closer look." Derek reeled. "Are you crazy?" he said. She shot him a look. "You just said not to go near it." "Going back means something far worse than death," she said. "Of that I am sure. It might be better to move forward into the unknown than go back to that hell." Derek bit his lip. Finally, he gave a frustrated sigh, hating what they were about to do. "Yeah, I guess you're right," he said. With the decision made, they came forward, one small, silent step at a time. The breathing continued uninterrupted. Derek's eyes flew all over, trying to locate the source of the breathing. Yet nothing but solid rock was to be seen, and before them was still the dead end of the tunnel. Soon, they would reach the end and have nowhere else to go. Finally, they came within arm's reach of the wall. Neither Derek nor Megan reached out to touch it. His heart was hammering in his chest as the breathing had become so loud that it threatened to make him clap his hands over his ears. Megan winced with every wave of the breathing, as it was making her uncomfortable too. They looked at each other. Derek knew they didn't have to say anything. Neither one of them wanted to touch the wall. He could feel it. The end of the cave was wrong somehow. Yet in this place, it wasn't unexpected. Still, he shuddered to think of the horror that could unfold here. With a slow nod, he went ahead and started to reach his hand out. The breathing droned on between long gusts and moaning whooshes. It was a haunting melody that Derek knew he would never forget. It would replay forever in his nightmares. If he lived long enough to have nightmares, that was. His fingers came just near to the wall. Then he suddenly pulled his fingers back when he thought he saw just the slightest bit of movement. He looked at Megan. She looked back at him, her eyes wide and afraid. "Did you see that?" he mouthed at her. She nodded. They both turned to look back at the wall. The breath sucked in, and now that he was paying closer attention, he saw that the wall actually contracted ever so slightly. Then, as the breath was let out, they watched with horror as the wall stretched. It was impossible to see from afar, but now that they were this close, they could see that this was no mere cave wall. It was something else, and it seemed to be alive. Megan tugged at Derek's shirt, leading him to take small, careful steps away from the breathing wall. They backed up half a dozen paces when the breathing cut off so completely that the silence screamed in Derek's ears. Then the wall began to pulse. Instead of minuscule movement, the undulations made slow but rolling ripples in the dark material. What they thought was once dull stone now gained a sheen as small, clear droplets formed on its elastic surface. The wall began to squelch and make squishing sounds that made Derek want to retch. Red bled into the charcoal black surface until it looked like a piece of pulsing flesh. Derek realized with horror that it was exactly that. It was a membrane. A light flashed from the other side of the membrane. Megan gasped. They saw shapes beyond the red viscous. The light flashed again. This time, the shapes were closer. The membrane continued to pulse, sinking in time with the flashes of light that bathed the cave in a blood-red glow. Each time, the shapes were just a little bit closer. Each time they came into view, Derek saw with mounting horror that the shapes became less and less obscure, their forms becoming clearer. Megan clasped a hand to her mouth. "Oh my God," she said, trembling. Derek could not voice what he saw, even he wanted to, because his entire mouth had gone bone dry. The shapes beyond the pulsing membrane became unmistakable. They were people. Their bodies were suspended somehow in a large, cavernous space. Ever so slowly, they were floating closer to the wall of the membrane, Derek was rooted to the spot in sheer terror, unable to process how to react to what he was seeing. He knew he should take Megan and run, but his mind could not dwell on anything other than his fear. It was too much. Megan fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. Words began to tumble from her lips, her eyes rolling into the back of her head. The moving house. The moving house. The moving house. She said over and over again. Derek couldn't tear his eyes away as one of the bodies pressed against the membrane. It stretched outwards in response. The face of the person became outlined as it pressed further and further into the tunnel. Then the hands came, fingers splayed, then the body. It looked like the body of a teenager from the size of it. It was completely still until Derek heard Kyle's voice call for them from further back in the tunnel. "Derek, Megan," he said, hollering. "Are you guys up there?" The face suddenly jerked in the direction of Kyle's voice. The hands pressed forward, coming together at a point. Then, the membrane thinned and threatened to tear. Derek collapsed, his knees giving way. He bumped into Megan, who was still in her trance. The pain in his shins from striking the stone knocked some sense back into him. He grabbed Megan and shook her. She continued to babble, the words coming out so fast now that they blurred together. "The moving house, the moving house, the moving house," she said. "Megan," he said, shaking her harder. "Snap out of it." She continued on, deep in her trance. Derek turned when he heard the most stomach-churning ripping sound he had ever heard in his life. The hands had finally made an opening, and now they were widening the gap. Other bodies were pressed against the membrane now, dozens of them. It bulged outwards, and Derek saw that with so many crowded against the membrane, it had closed much of the gap between them. The hands that continued to tear at the pulsing flesh were fish corpse pale and bloodless. They scrabbled along the slick membrane with feverish intensity. The joints made awful clicking noises, as if they were disjointing and reconnecting over and over again. Derek thought the sound would make him go insane. Derek heard a scream from behind him. He turned to see Kyle stopped dead in his tracks, his mouth dropped open. Amber and Sophie had their hands to their mouths, looks of terror in their eyes. Derek felt a jerk in his arms and was suddenly hit in the face. Megan had started to convulse. "Help me," he said. For a moment, he thought the others would ignore him. Another part of him was sure that they would all turn back around and flee for their lives. Sophie moved first, and that woke up the others. They rushed to his side. Kyle and Sophie managed to grab Megan's arms. She thrashed, beginning to froth at the mouth. "What's wrong with her?" Amber said. "What is that?" "Just get up and run," Derek said. As one, they hauled Megan up and began to drag her away. Before they got too far, a small but familiar voice called out to them. It stopped them cold. "Don't leave me." It sounded like Ryan. They all turned around, the screams freezing in their throats. It was Ryan, or something that looked like him. His face stared out at them. He had a shoulder and one arm free of the membrane. The rest of him was lost in the writhing mass of bodies that all pressed for release behind him. His eyes were ink black, and there was a horrible, gaunt grin on his face, showing too much of his teeth. "Don't leave me behind. Come back." Derek was horrified to see that when he spoke, his mouth didn't move. Black tears leaked like sludge down the Ryan thing's cheeks. "Come back," he said again. Other voices joined him, repeating his words. Derek realized then how the breathing was so loud before. It was all those bodies, all breathing in unison, a macabre, slumbering choir from hell. "Come back," they said. "Come back, come back, come back." With all his might, Derek pried his eyes away from the horrible sight, just as more bodies were tearing through the membrane. He shoved the others into action. Then they ran screaming into the darkness, all the while, the voices never ceasing to follow at their heels. "Come back! Come back! Come back!"